Thank you for inviting me. I'm honored to be back in Korea again. My relationship and the U.S. relationship with Korea is very strong. I've been asked to describe my speculation and information about what might happen next with respect to export controls for the remainder of the Biden administration and for the Trump administration. And I have a slide deck which is available to anyone with a lot of additional information, but I will give the highlights of my speculation for the next 30 minutes, or 29 minutes. So with respect to the remainder of the Biden administration, which runs until January 20th, the first bullet here describes what I expect to be a series of significant and aggressive new controls to address 3 of the 4 main policy objectives of the Biden administration for export control issues. And they are basically, by whatever means, cut off the flow of US and non-US origin hardware, software, and technology for companies in China to develop or produce advanced node semiconductors, the compute side of what's needed for artificial intelligence applications, semiconductor production equipment, and then the 4th topic pertains to supercomputers. So basically, the Biden administration determined in October of 2022 that the capability of China and companies in China to produce those 4 technologies is a per se national security threat to the United States and its close allies. And based upon media reports, tomorrow and later this week, there will be a series of new controls imposed on hundreds of additional Chinese companies that make semiconductor manufacturing equipment, new controls on particular fabs in China that make either advanced node semiconductors or might in the future, or that might one day produce semiconductors for the Huawei company, and also additional controls on the high bandwidth memory that's needed to work with graphics processing units for data centers in order to conduct and run large language models which are needed for artificial intelligence applications. And then I also predict that in the rules that we will see tomorrow and this week, hundreds of companies that make semiconductor production equipment in China to be added to the entity list, to be subject to sanctions, and as part of the effort of the United States in order to delay and degrade the ability of those 4 sectors in China to function. The most common, and that will continue in December and probably all the way up to January 20th, as the Biden administration tries to finish as many of the rules that it has been working on these last several years before it leaves. The second most common question I get is, what will the Trump administration do? And I have many ways of saying, I don't know. The conventional wisdom is, as I have here in the second bullet, that the Trump administration will be based upon the experience with the first administration, transactional, meaning everything is subject to negotiations. That is, there might be a trade-off or a compromise or a change of policy in one area in order to address an unrelated area. And so that can lead to surprising outcomes. So that's prediction number 1. Prediction number 2 is that the types of controls in my world that I deal with in export controls will be far, far more aggressive than even the extremely aggressive controls of the Biden administration. That is, the Trump administration will build upon and impose more controls on more technologies and have a broader scope and basis for punishing or sanctioning Chinese companies. With respect to Russia, I suspect at some point there will be a negotiation and a compromise with respect to the types of sanctions that are imposed against Russia as part of the final deal. Unfortunately, I think also there will be less regard and less respect and less consideration for close allies. The Biden administration has been very careful to work closely and as a like-minded country with the governments of Korea, Japan, the United Kingdom, Netherlands, and all of the other close allies in an appeal to common interests where the two countries have a common security interests and topics. I'm not saying they've always agreed. There have often been, in my world, very significant disagreements, but at least they were treated as allies. And it is possible, given some of the statements of the Trump administration, that they will be more willing to impose sanctions or take more hostile action against allied country companies that don't cooperate with positions such as requests to impose more controls against China. And then the big unknown and the big uncertainty is what viewing export controls through the lens of the Trump administration's mantra and the campaign's mantra of America first. And sometimes that can cut in completely different directions. During the first administration, sometimes President Trump himself would approve individual exports because it was good for US industry, whereas his career staff and senior staff would want to deny them. And so these are all examples of why no one really knows what will happen. There are some announcements regarding the secretaries who will be in charge at the Departments of State and the Department of Commerce, which are two of the key departments that make export control policy. The nominee for the State Department, Senator Marco Rubio from Florida, is one of the few senators who has taken very active interest in export controls personally and in a very hawkish way, meaning he, for many years, has been calling for far more aggressive controls imposed against China, both unilaterally and requiring our allies to do so as well. And because the State Department is such a key decision maker and policy maker with respect to export control policy, that suggests far more controls, far more technologies, far more entity list actions, far broader and more aggressive unilateral controls. But on the other hand, the Secretary of Commerce nominee has no apparent background or history on this topic. And so his views are completely unknown. Also, the people who are the next layer down, the undersecretaries and the assistant secretaries, who are the ones who handle the day-to-day administration of policy thinking and decision-making, have not been announced or rumored. And in this area of export controls where personnel is policy, there are a relatively small number of people in each administration who will set the tone and direction. And until we see who those people are, we won't have a really good sense for the actual direction of US export control policy. With respect to tariffs, I think we can say with certainty that you will see tariff actions long before any export control policy changes. In fact, just as I was sitting here on my phone, I saw that Trump announced that he will immediately impose sanctions against Mexico and Canada and China on his first day. Just happened 5 minutes ago. So that is definitely before any changes on export policy. With respect to the big picture of this topic that I've been working in for 31 years, we are now going through, as allies, Korea, the US, and the others, as significant of a change in thinking about the role and purpose of regulating the flow of hardware, software, and technology, as was the case at the end of the Cold War. And at the core of the discussion, at the center of all of these issues, is really a very active discussion in the US and within the allies of what exactly does national security mean with respect to the regulation and flow of hardware, software, and technologies. And at least in the United States, there is also a very active policy discussion that will continue into the Trump administration about how export controls should be used to address human rights issues. And I think you will see that continue in a Trump administration as well. But just for those of you who are new to export controls, the topic is boiled down into this one sentence. So my entire professional career is all on this one page. And it's the rules that govern the export, re-export, and transfer by US and non-US persons from inside the US and from outside the US of both US and non-US origin commodities, software, technology, and services to destinations, end uses, and end users to accomplish various national security and foreign policy objectives. And export controls are not these other areas of trade policy which are part of a broader economic security agenda, such as sanctions and import controls and direct investment and outbound investment controls, tariffs, or more recently in the United States, information and communication technology, supply chain controls to regulate domestic transactions. And each one of these topics could be its own discussion. So just to repeat, to summarize 2 years of some of the most complex rules that have ever been written, this is the summary of everything the Biden administration has been doing for the last 4 years. They have been continuing the classical original purpose for export controls of identifying the items that are critical to the production or development or use of weapons of mass destruction or conventional weapons, and working with Korea and the other regime allies to do so. So that commitment has not changed. But the summary of everything the Biden administration has done for, in addition to that, is in the second bullet point. And again, it's to cut off the flow of anything, whether US made or foreign made, to China or to Chinese companies that would in any way help Chinese companies to develop or produce advanced node semiconductors, the compute power that's needed for AI applications, front-end semiconductor manufacturing equipment, and then supercomputers. And with respect to Russia, the objective has been to cut off the flow of everything that is needed for the Russian industrial base. And what's evolved in the last 4 years is this really interesting ad hoc arrangement of countries that have come together to achieve some of the export control policy objectives together. Because the traditional way of working through the Wassenaar arrangement has basically failed because Russia is a member of the Wassenaar Arrangement and Russia has been blocking progress. And so these 4 multilateral arrangements have evolved in the last few years. The AUKUS arrangement, the arrangement with Japan and the Netherlands over production equipment, the Wassenaar -1 controls, which most recently imposed controls on quantum computers, and the coalition of 38 countries against Russia. The other defining characteristic of the Biden administration has been to continue the aggressive enforcement of all transactions that would in any way help or support the Chinese company Huawei. And the Biden administration has done so through a very unusual, novel, creative combination of controls over actual items, prohibitions against specific end uses, sanctions against specific companies that are involved in these sectors, and then for this audience, most importantly, extraterritorial controls, meaning the application of US law over non-US made items and non-US countries. And then, in addition, some very expansive, novel prohibitions against US companies, even involving foreign-made items. And so it has created, for this audience, an extraordinarily complex list of extraterritorial rules called the Foreign Direct Product Rules. And this is just the list of the titles of the Foreign Direct Product Rules that have been created recently. I wrote 2 of them, but the others were all written after I left government. And I fully expect that before the Biden administration leaves in January, there will be many additional foreign direct product rules subjecting non-US origin items destined to China to US controls. For this audience in particular, the thing to keep in mind is that the way in which the US government has written these extraterritorial rules, the foreign direct product rules, they apply to literally every semiconductor on the planet. I'm going to repeat that. The US has asserted export control jurisdiction of every semiconductor on the planet, no matter what type. And the basis for that is that in every fab in the planet so far, there are at least some US origin tools and other equipment that are used to produce semiconductors. And the US government has taken the position that the use of equipment or technology or software that is from the United States causes the foreign-made semiconductors and any other items to become subject to all of these various US controls that I just mentioned. And so for a Korean or a Japanese or Dutch or any other country that makes semiconductors or semiconductor equipment, the level of complexity involved in complying with US law is quite high. I'm going to skip through to what I know you're asking for, which is what's going to happen with the Trump administration. And main point, again, no one really knows. There are lots of competing forces, and Mr. Trump himself often will take completely contradictory positions. And so it's hard to exactly predict, since this topic was not mentioned in the campaign. So what I've done, and again, you can have these slide decks and read these slides as you like later, is I went through and I read everything that a Trump supporter has said about export controls the last several years in either testimony or articles or at conferences, and I've listed out for you all of the questions that they have asked at these various meetings. And the first one for this audience is whether the Trump administration would impose sanctions against a Korean, Japanese, or other allied country company that legally sells to China items that a US company could not? And I don't know the answer. It's something that the Biden administration was very careful not to do, but I could easily see a Trump administration saying that if an allied country company legally continued to sell semiconductors or semiconductor production equipment to China under its own laws, that the US government might sanction that company. So that's a question to watch. Second question, given the Trump administration's view that, quote, economic security is national security and that all policy should be America first, an open question is whether the Trump administration will use export controls to give economic advantage to specific companies or to economically harm a foreign company, which is a broader concept than the traditional national security objectives of the Biden administration, which, although they clearly apply to commercial technologies, are all focused on the types of technologies that the Chinese military needs to modernize. I'll repeat that last point. Whatever your thought about the Biden administration's export control policies, they all ultimately had one objective, which was to regulate the enabling technologies that are needed for the Chinese government to modernize its military. The Trump administration will certainly have that objective, but the question is whether it will go farther than that and use export controls as part of a broader economic agenda. Next question, whether the allied countries will agree to cooperate with any of these policies or agree to align their controls with the new Trump administration policy. I look forward to hearing your answers to that question, but it is a significant question. With respect to this audience, a common question I get is whether export controls will be applied not just to the production of advanced node semiconductors in China, but also legacy node semiconductors, the older semiconductors. There is one view of some Trump administration thinkers in this area that in order to respond to the oversupply of Chinese legacy node semiconductors, that US export controls should be used against those items. The Biden administration had been very careful not to have an impact. Another almost philosophical question is whether the effectiveness of controls will even be considered. Because, for example, with legacy node semiconductors, there is the capability of Chinese companies to make such items without US technology. And it is possible that a Trump administration will say, we should nonetheless impose controls as a matter of principle, even if they won't have a significant or long-term effect on the production of those items, given this Chinese state policy of using commercial technologies generally as part of its military-civil fusion policies to modernize its military. That is, the thought might be, as a general matter, even if a control is not that effective, or even if a control is counterproductive, as a matter of principle, we as a country shouldn't be allowing the support for what China needs, even indirectly, to modernize its military, and even if it's very indirect, such as the types of items that are used to make semiconductors. In addition to high bandwidth memory controls, which I fully expect to become subject to controls this week or in December, the question is what additional items will be imposed in order to prevent data centers, either in China or by Chinese companies outside of China, in order to run large language models. As you may have known, a year ago, the Biden administration imposed significant controls on the export of GPUs for use in data centers to the Middle East because of the risk that they would be diverted from the Middle East to China. President Trump will have a very different relationship with the Middle East, and so a question is whether exports to the Middle East will become more liberal, while at the same time exports to or involving China will become more strict. There's a broader question about whether frontier AI models should be allowed to be developed outside of the United States, which are the very, very advanced artificial intelligence models. And so it's possible that either at the end of a Biden administration or sometime during a Trump administration, there will be quotas on the limits of the total number of semiconductors that could be allowed to be exported to any particular country in order to prevent that country from producing a frontier AI model, one of these very advanced artificial general intelligence models. Another question to watch is whether the mere act of uploading the weights and models for artificial intelligence applications will become subject to controls in the US or abroad. Another very big question that might happen before the end of the Biden administration is whether controls will be imposed on the access into data centers that contain these American-designed GPUs or that contain high bandwidth memory, and basically prohibit Chinese companies from using a data center anywhere in the world, including in the United States or Korea or any allied country, to prohibit Chinese companies from having access to data centers in order to run large language models for artificial intelligence applications. I'm confident that the US Congress is in support of these objectives and will support whatever the Biden or Trump administrations wants to do. So in any event, I have literally 20 more pages and 3 hours worth of commentary. So I'm going to stop there in order to stay within my 30 minutes. And I encourage any of you to reach out to me directly or at the conference if you have additional questions about what might happen or what the things are to watch for this week, next week, December, and during a Trump administration with respect to this topic that historically most people never even knew about, but now is at the center of US national security and economic security policy with respect to its allies, and particularly with respect to China. So again, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm very impressed and very honored and humbled to be here today, and I look forward to being a resource and staying in touch as much as you like. Thank you very much.